Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading, and then we examine a single relevant question that passage points us to. Today I'm joined by Sheryl Daughety, and we're looking at a passage from Numbers chapter 7. So the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Pentateuch, they record the story of the birth of the nation of Israel and its freedom and journey from the slavery of Egypt into the Promised Land. And the books of Exodus and Numbers in particular detail the journey from Egypt into the Promised Land. But Numbers is different than Exodus in that it emphasizes families instead of tribes. So there are 89 verses in chapter 7, frankly, 89 tedious verses, which detail offerings that were brought to the tabernacle by a representative from each tribe. I don't know if you've ever read a chapter like this and wondered why the Bible so painstakingly writes out the details of something that seems to be so repetitive. But out of the Pentateuch, only Numbers focuses on families and tribes. The other books tell the story of Israel from a national perspective. And so you may ask some questions like, why is he focusing on these families and tribes? Why would God intentionally separate tribes of Israel geographically in the Promised Land? The later history of Israel shows that the tribal segregation seemed to create more division than it did unity. The tribes functioned as this loose federation up until the time of David. And David managed to unite people by making Jerusalem the capital city, but that unity was very short-lived. And so emphasizing tribes seems to contribute to the division. The ultimate division occurred when there was a full civil war that happened after the reign of Solomon, which resulted in this split between the north and the south of the Promised Land. And it makes more sense that God should emphasize and conceive Israel as this united people rather than segregating them into tribes and families. After all, God's ultimate plan was to unite the nation. You see that in Ezekiel 37:22. I will unify them into one nation on the mountains of Israel. One king will rule them all. No longer will they be divided into two nations or into two kingdoms. But the families were actually critical for the long-term survival of Israel as a nation. You see, families not based on social status or the power of the state, but on this sense of identity. The story of Israel begins with one single couple, Abraham and Sarah, and they grow into a family, and eventually this series of tribes, and eventually the tribes become a nation. In order to create a society that sticks together, however, there's more needed than just a sizable nation. You don't just need a lot of people. A society is larger than the individual, but smaller than the state. So families, neighborhoods, communities are critical for the long-term survival of a group of people. They create this sense of connection to the nation for each purpose or person. And the family focus of the book of Numbers reminds us that the family is critical to the survival of a nation and of a culture. When the Jewish people read Numbers chapter 7, each of them are reminded that their ancestors were specifically involved in the history of Israel, and therefore each individual is connected as well. So, Cheryl, we as Americans don't often emphasize family as this important factor to help individuals feel connected to national history. But how might families also be important to help individuals feel connected to Christian history?
I think a lot of that can depend on your particular family because, I'm very blessed to be able to say that I don't know far enough back in the history of our family on either side to know a life without Christianity. I know as far back as like my great grandparents were Christians, and I don't really know, past that. But I also think on the other side of that, if you are currently a Christian, but you know that there were people in your lineage who were not, you could probably look at the way that they lived and see how things changed and why as a result of that. How is your life different than somebody's might have been a few generations ago because they were not raised in a Christian household. Because as we know, it's about a lot more than just what you believe, because it should affect every part of your life and what you value, how you spend your time, how you raise your children, your family unit.
I don't know a family outside of Christianity myself, but I do know like the stories of and the person who would have at least the family that I'm in, how they would have come to Christ. So um, my grandmother, my dad's mom got saved first. So my dad's family was deeply involved in church all of my life, and
Okay.
but my mom's family was not.
Oh, really?
Her brother, who is dead now, she would probably use this word too. He was mostly a heathen all of his life, right? Her dad too. Her dad wasn't. They were both alcoholics. Her sister.
Well, I'm not saying there hasn't been some of that.
Yeah, no, I
No,
know.
I'm not saying that.
Her mom, my grandmother on my mom's side, went to church nominally. That's how she was not. She was a good person, but her faith, she didn't talk about it much. She was just present. Right. My dad's family. So his mom got saved early in her marriage. So she wasn't saved when she got married to my grandfather. She got saved early in her marriage. And then my grandfather was a moonshiner. And he got saved in jail. And so obviously that's way before my time. If I had to guess, it would have been somewhere in the 1920s, which tracks around Prohibition.
Sure, yeah.
Great Depression. But that's all I ever knew. So they had 6 kids, 3 girls and 3 boys. The 2 oldest boys were not overly involved in church. One of them never. The second oldest boy got saved at an older age, and when he got saved, I mean, like he was as anti-church God anything you can imagine. He had been married 2 or 3 times. He hauled cars, and he got married after the wife that I knew when I was born. When she died, he remarried this woman who was deep in church, right? Which was out of his character. And he got saved and started paying tithes, which was a big deal. That's a big deal. That was a big deal for him because he was fairly wealthy. But my dad and his sisters, I only ever knew them as church-going people, active in church. My grandmother was 95 when she died, and well into her 80s, she did crafts in the children's Sunday school class every Sunday. I mean, well into her 80s. And, it changed the trajectory of our lives. She has, my dad's 2 kids are both pastors. One of the 2 of the girls never had children. The oldest sister, she's still living. She's in her 90s now. 2 of her kids were very active in ministry, and it can change the trajectory. And it's good for us to tell those stories, right? It's good for us to remind, especially our children, right? It hasn't all, you don't know how lucky you are, right?
Yeah. Well, my daughter and I are recently having this conversation, who's 19. And she has a friend who is starting to ask questions about Christianity now. He'd never been open to it before. And I have been trying to help her find even just a simple study to give this person or to do with this person. And anyway, long story short is that I'm really struggling to find one because everything always assumes that you're starting out knowing something or that you've already accepted Christ. And she and I started to have this conversation, and she said, even I, and I said, neither can I, because I can't relate to that, because whether you chose to live the lifestyle or not, or accept where your place in this big picture was, because everybody handles that differently. She or I, neither one can relate to what it's like to be brought up in a household where Jesus is not part of the conversation or your life from the very beginning, where, church is not an option. That's just the life that you were born into. And so it's created some conversation and thoughts between she and I about, like, okay, well, we need to know how to begin to teach and reach people who really are starting from zero. But I do also realize that it can be hard for us to relate to when you've never been there before.
I didn't pay attention to this until I was, certainly since I've been pastor here, so in the last 15 years, but probably closer to the last 10 years. Even words that I use and phrases that I use when I'm delivering a message.
Yeah.
Right? Well, you know the story of Noah.
Right.
Well, maybe not. Right? How many people in that room don't? Even, and I would even say the danger of things like that is there are people who believe they're Christians that don't read their Bible, have very limited biblical knowledge. So you just have to assume everybody in the room is an idiot, right?
Well, not idiot.
No, well, I mean, that's the wrong word. You have to assume everybody's at ground zero when it comes to biblical knowledge and how you say things.
Yeah.
Have you looked at The Case for Christ by Liev Strobel?
I don't think I have.
Are you familiar with that?
I've heard of it before, but I've not read it. Everything it assumes you have already accepted Christ or that you're already reading your Bible.
He was an atheist that became converted, and he makes the case for Jesus. I don't know if that's relevant or not. But,
I'll check into it.
Do you think still today that family is the prime structure for society?
Did you plan this question for me?
No, I didn't.
I do.
But it's a good one for you to answer.
It is, because I am a firm believer that it is still the primary structure of our society. I do not believe, however, that it is valued that way anymore. I don't think it's valued that way by our society, and I think that it is often not valued that way by families themselves. And I think that part of that has come from the fact that we are now so much more driven toward individual success, or, what's best for you, even to the point that we treat our kids that way. So, like, if this is good for this child to gain this skill, knowledge, whatever the case may be, or to have this opportunity, but the rest of the family pays a price for it, well, it's still worth it because it's great for this kid, as opposed to us paying more attention to the health of the family unit as a whole. Because, as a parent, that there are things that would be advantageous for you that probably would not have been for your kids. So you get to the point that you have to make a choice, what I want this whole picture to look like.
Yeah.
How do I want for this to turn out? Because I just feel like we are in a time of infinite opportunity, which can be a great thing, but your family can pay the cost for that.
I think there are a lot of pressures on families that cause it to be less effective than it should be. My greatest regret in life is divorce. And sometimes when I say that, people try to read into it that I don't appreciate what I have. I do appreciate what I have.
Sure.
But I know the
cost.
The cost that it took on my family, even on my grandkids who know nothing about it, right? They only see me and their other grandmother as fine friends. Everybody gets along. That's all they see. They don't know any different, but there's still a cost. And so there's two pieces to that have minimized the family unit. Divorce and not getting married, right? Both of those are present, right? The divorce rate is declining, but not because more people are getting married. It's because less people are getting married, you know, um, or they're getting married later in life, right? Um, and so we have made the family unit optional, right? Interestingly enough, when I say optional, I mean optional to either have one, or if I don't like this one, I'm going to go get another one, right? And the dynamics of that are so complex, right? To make it worthwhile, right? I was listening this morning. It's the same. I don't want to get sidetracked, but I heard a guy. I don't think I'd ever heard it preached right this way, but he was right. He was like, if you went to the church at Ephesus, you went to the church at Ephesus. And if you didn't like what was going on, you didn't pull up and go to the church at Corinth. You stayed and figured it out at the church at Ephesus, because the church was the church in that town. That was all there was. And so you figured it out, right? The good, the bad, the ugly. And we've created that same type of consumerism in church, and we've created that same type of consumerism in the family unit. If I don't like this, I'm going to do something else. I don't have to make the choices, even financial choices.
Oh, absolutely, financial choices.
Right, that we go into debt or whatever the case may be. Sacrifice our integrity. A whole myriad of things, and the family was intended. We have Americanized a lot of things that Scripture, and then we try to apply Scripture to it, and it don't work because we've created a whole different model, So, yeah, I think we've done some damage to the family by making it optional.
I agree.
That's making it optional. It's not optional.
No, and I'm not one of those people who thinks that like every mom needs to stay home. And I have been a homeschool mom, although my life has looked a lot different from most homeschool moms because I've worked too. But I don't believe that it has to be traditional in that sense. But I do believe that we have a very finite amount of time that they're going to be with us. And gosh, I speak as somebody whose daughter just went to college. It goes by so fast, you're not going to believe it. And you will never be able to get it back. And you have so much more influence on them and their faith than you can. We have so much more influence than we give ourselves credit for. And there's still some things now I would do differently.
There's a lot of things I would do differently.
Oh, of course. But us studying the Bible together every day as part of our school is not one of the things that I would change.
That you regret.
No. And my prayer is that is going to continue on through my kids and their families too.
What are some of the ways that the family is under attack currently?
I mean, I think the very individualistic society is a big one right now. I think that careers is a huge one. I even think that some things that seem kind of like in the facet of families, like for instance, I mean, it could be the sports or whatever the extracurricular activities are. I mean, I guess that's a good example because it's nothing for people to leave for an entire weekend for those things now. And what they're doing in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that we don't realize like what we are actually teaching our kids is, well, it's okay for us not to be at church because of this, because this ultimately must be more important if we're going to miss church as a result of it, which is more than about just missing church. You understand what I'm saying?
It's community.
Yes, it's community. And your involvement as a leader and volunteer,
a lot of those things. So like, a social issue right now that we try to help at Christmas time is a lot of kids don't eat food except at school.
Right.
Right. So that's a big
Not
deal.
as much as they should anyway.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the same is true spiritually. A lot of kids are getting nothing spiritually except at church. And when you remove that from their life, you're removing the only spiritual nourishment that they're getting. Now, that's not always the case, right?
Right.
But that is often the case, that we're taking the one piece of, there's a meme going around, and you could insert church or faith or Bible reading or prayer or whatever you want to, but it says something to the effect of, parents, don't be surprised that when church is not important to you, when your kid becomes an adult, that
That's
it's
right.
not important to them. And you could insert Bible reading or prayer or devotion or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
If whatever you make the most important in that family unit, they're going to follow that. They're going to believe that's the way and take it a step further.
Yep.
At least that's my experience.
So I guess it's, all that kind of boils down to like your values as far as what's under attack. Like, what are the things that we truly value, and how are we going to live those things out and teach those values to our kids? Because there are lots of things we love and lots of things that are important. But I think we have to remember what kind of foundation we want to build for our kids. And if we're constantly basing it on things that can change and shift over time, then you should expect for their faith to do that too. And we're not going to live forever, so like we have to think about what kind of foundations we're teaching our kids to stand on in their lives, even when you're gone.
There's a lot of rhetoric about the family being under attack in the world. And we point to things like the disintegration of the family union or homosexual marriage, all which are politically charged units or conversations. But one of the attacks that is much more subtle but way more effective are options.
Yes.
We live in a world full of options. We take our grandkids to New York City every year at Christmas. I decided to look for something on Facebook, and now all I see are things to do in New York, at Christmas time. Well, there's 1,000 things I had no idea were even there, right? I didn't even know these places existed. But all of a sudden, because I looked for one thing, I've got 1,000 options now.
Yeah.
And I don't think we realize the subtlety of that all of a sudden now we've got thousands of options, right? And parents are doom scrolling, they get buried in it. And then what do I choose? And they often are choosing, they don't want to miss out on anything. So they choose everything except the right thing. Right. Except the dinner, except the church service, except the prayer time, except the Bible study. And it's much more subtle, but it's a real attack.
It is. But this is the good thing about it. It is our choice. It doesn't matter what is being pushed in your direction. It doesn't matter what kind of challenges you're facing. It doesn't matter what kind of attacks you are under. Ultimately, we all get to make that choice for ourselves. We all get to choose.
That's right.
What we're going to do, what's going to be most important, and how we're going to spend our times, where we're going to put our efforts and our values.
Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue our conversation around the book of Numbers.